they are. Now, even before you go program the part, I want you to get the tools set up in the Centroid tool library. In the tool library, you're going to find two columns, a height offset column and a diameter offset. Each tool that you have is going to have its own unique height and diameter offset. The diameter offset's pretty easy to understand. It's simply the diameter of the tool. This is also where cutter comp gets its value to use. So when the control is using the cutter comp feature, it's going to look in the tool library's diameter offset table for the information about that tool. Now we're going to talk more about cutter comp in the programming section. So all you have to do to set the diameter offset for the tools is measure the diameter of the tool and type that number in. It's that simple. Now the height offset is a little bit more confusing. What the control needs to know is the difference in length of these tools. There's a couple of different ways to come up with the height offset values for your tools. The one I'm going to show you now is probably the easiest method if you have a bed mill or a machining center. Now if you got a knee mill, there's a different technique that you have to use, which we're going to show you a little later on in the video. I'm going to show you right now the most common method when using a bed mill or a machining center. Because there's a unique thing about a bed mill or a machining center is the distance from Z home, which is where we're at right now, which is where the head's going to be when you're done homing out, to the top of the table is always the same. The table doesn't move. The only thing that moves here in the Z is the column. So when the machine's done homing out, that distance from this point to the top of the table is a fixed distance. We're going to use that fact to come up with a height offset value for each individual tool. And the method in a nutshell is we're going to load the tool up into the column and jog down to a point in which we're going to call a reference point. All that is a place on the table in which we're going to decide to measure all our tools from. The control then will remember the distance that it takes to move from the home position to that reference point. And then each tool will have its own unique value, its own unique length.
Now, to start measuring tools on a Centroid-equipped bed mill or machining center, all you have to do is make sure that the machine is homed out. Here you see that we have the machine powered up with the machine home not set message being displayed, so all we got to do is hit cycle start to home the machine out. Once the machine is homed out, we need to be in the tool library menu to record the height offset values for each tool. To get to the tool offset library from the main menu, press F1 Setup, F2 Tool, and then F1 Offset. Once you're in the tool offset menu, move the cursor to the height offset value for the tool number that you'd like to measure. In this case, we're measuring tool 1, so we're moving the cursor to height offset value number 1. Now, with the tool loaded up in the spindle, jog that tool down and touch off of the reference position. Remember, a reference position is simply a point in which we choose to measure all our tools from. You could use the top of the table or the top of the vise to set your tools, but the method that we prefer is using a 1, 2, 3 block or any gauge block placed upon the top of the table. We like using this method because you can move the 1, 2, 3 block out of the way while you're jogging the tool down. It makes touching off your tools faster and easier. Once you have the tool just touching the top of that gauge block, hit the F2 measure button and the control records the height offset value for that tool. Okay, we're finished up with tool number 1, so let's do a tool change. Press the tool check button to retract the Z-axis to the home position. Now, just as a reminder, the actual height offset values that we're measuring for each tool using this particular method is simply the distance that the machine has to move that particular tool from the home position down to the top of the gauge block. Now, to set up all the other tools that we have to measure, we simply follow the same procedure. So next we're loading up tool number 2 into the spindle. That's our 1/4 inch drill bit. Then we're going to jog on down and touch off the top of the gauge block. To get the tool down close to the gauge block in a hurry, we're using the fast continuous jog mode. Then we switch over to slow continuous mode once we get within an inch or so of the gauge block. Once you get pretty close to the gauge block, switch on over to incremental jog mode. Start out with the increment set on the times 100 setting. Then, once you get the tool within 10 or 20 thousandths of the gauge block, switch the increment over to the times 10 setting. This will move the tool down only a thousandth of an inch each time you touch the jog button. Be sure to move the gauge block out of the way each time that you move the tool down. Okay, we have tool 2 just touching the top of the gauge block, so we're going to hit F2 manual to manually measure the height offset of tool number 2. Okay, now we're ready to go measure tool number 3, so we're going to hit tool check to retract the column to the home position for an easy tool change. While we're getting switched over to tool number 3, I'd like to make the point that you don't have to measure your tools in any particular order. We could have just as easily started out measuring tool 3 rather than tool 1. Now for tool 3, we just do the same thing and jog on down and touch off the top of the gauge block and then hit the F2 manual measure button to measure the height offset for that tool. While we're doing that, I'd like to also mention that once you get a tool set up in the Centroid tool library, the control retains that information. So typically, you only have to measure the height offset value of a tool once. Okay, we've got tool 3, our end mill, touching the top of the gauge block, so it's time to hit F2 manual to manually measure the height offset of tool number 3. And once you're done, go ahead and hit tool check to retract the tool to the tool change position. The final step in measuring the tool heights is to hit F10 save to save the information to the tool library. Okay, we got our tool heights all set up in the tool library. Now it's time to go set up the diameter offsets for each tool. To do that, it's very simple. All we have to do is measure the actual diameter of each tool and type that number in. For tool number 1, our center drill, we're putting in 75 thousandths. And for tool number 2, our drill bit, we're putting in 1/4 of an inch, 0.25. And for tool number 3, our end mill, we're coming up with 3/8 of an inch, 0.375. When you're all done typing in the diameters, be sure to hit F10 to save that information into the Centroid tool library.